The end of World War II brought with it an uneasy silence across Europe. The cessation of hostilities did not simply mark a moment of victory or defeat, it marked a shift into a landscape of uncertainty. This was a landscape now littered with the remnants of a conflict that had engulfed nations for 6 long years. While cities and towns began to rebuild, vast areas remained in the grip of another crisis, one that would only gradually make itself known: the fate of the enormous stockpiles of military material scattered across the continent. Among the most enduring legacies of wartime logistics were the ammunition dumps, vast, often hidden, collections of shells, bombs, mines, and gunpowder, many of which had been abandoned when the war ended, leaving the future of this explosive cargo in limbo. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the problem became apparent. Allied and Axis forces had created massive networks of ammunition depots throughout occupied Europe, ranging from simple warehouse structures to well-guarded underground bunkers. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of tons of munitions lay unguarded in these locations. According to some estimates, more than 10 million tons of unexploded ordnance (UXO) were scattered across Europe at the war's end, most of it stored in these dumps. The sheer quantity alone posed an immediate and long-term threat, but the complexity of the task to dismantle or destroy it was compounded by Europe's dire economic situation. The war had drained Europe's resources, and nations were left struggling to recover. As economies reeled from the devastation of the war and the immense loss of human life, there was no immediate or obvious solution for dealing with the enormous stockpiles of ammunition. For many European governments, the matter became one of logistics rather than military strategy. The immediate priority was rebuilding infrastructure, reviving industry, and providing for the basic needs of civilians. Ammunition was, in the minds of many, a low-priority issue. Yet the scale of the problem was undeniable, especially in areas where these dumps were located in proximity to civilian populations or vital post-war reconstruction projects. One of the first official decisions came in the summer of 1945, just as the war was officially concluded in Europe. The Allied authorities, in cooperation with local governments, began to evaluate the condition of ammunition dumps left behind. In many cases, these sites had been hastily abandoned or simply forgotten as military personnel withdrew from occupied territories. The munitions themselves varied in condition. Some were still in sealed crates, others exposed to the elements, their fuses and explosives degraded by years of storage in unstable environments. The longer these stockpiles remained untouched, the more dangerous they became. The priority at the time was not so much to remove the ammunition, but to ensure that it would not cause further harm in the immediate aftermath of the war. In some cases, immediate actions were taken to neutralize the most dangerous sites. In the British and American zones of occupation, large numbers of the ammunition dumps were surveyed, and munitions that posed a clear risk to civilian populations or military personnel were disposed of, often by controlled detonations. This, however, was only a partial solution. The disposal process was painstakingly slow and expensive, requiring specialized teams to dismantle or destroy each cache. These operations were complicated by the nature of the stockpiles. The large variety of munitions, ranging from artillery shells to chemical weapons, necessitated different methods of disposal. At the same time, logistical challenges became apparent. Roads and railways had been severely damaged by the war, hindering the transportation of the necessary equipment to safely dispose of the munitions. The recovery of some ammunition required specialized equipment that simply wasn't available in large quantities. Resources were stretched thin as the victors turned their attention to the most urgent matters of reconstruction, particularly in Germany, where the most extensive stockpiles had been left behind. In Germany, the situation was especially dire. The vast majority of these dumps were located within the Soviet, British, and American occupation zones. In many cases, the stockpiles were so extensive that they could not simply be removed or destroyed in the short term. Soviet authorities, already managing the enormous task of dismantling the remnants of Nazi industry, opted to secure many of the dumps for potential use in future military operations, even though the immediate threat of war had passed. The question of repurposing these munitions would linger throughout the Cold War, as Europe's divided nature created new, geopolitical pressures that once again demanded the attention of military planners. In contrast, the British and American zones began systematic efforts to dismantle many of the larger dumps. However, by late 1945, the economic pressures began to outweigh the need to rid the land of dangerous munitions. The cost of continuing such extensive operations was simply too high, and there were limited resources available to maintain them. As a result, many of the dumps were simply sealed off and abandoned, left to be dealt with at a later date. Meanwhile, local authorities in various parts of Europe struggled with the mounting costs of clearing these abandoned dumps. In many cases, municipalities lacked the financial means to address the issue, and the importance of the stockpiles quickly became overshadowed by the growing demand for reconstruction. While some areas saw gradual efforts to clear these sites, most were left in place for years, creating an ongoing risk for future generations. The consequences of this neglect became evident in the following decades. By the late 1940s, the war's legacy began to take on an eerie, forgotten quality in much of Europe. Munitions were discovered by farmers, construction workers, and even children, who unknowingly stumbled upon remnants of war. These sudden, tragic discoveries were a reminder that Europe's landscape had been irrevocably altered, with remnants of war still embedded in the earth. The slow process of clearing ammunition dumps continued throughout the 1950s, but the economic and logistical challenges remained. Some of these sites were slowly converted into industrial areas or urban developments. However, many munitions dumps, particularly those located in remote or rural areas, were simply abandoned. No comprehensive plan was ever fully executed to rid Europe of these dangerous stockpiles, and their continued existence would come to define the early Cold War years. In 1955, a significant decision was made in the British zone. Rather than continue to deal with the costs of clearing ammunition dumps on a case-by-case basis, the British began to encourage local governments to convert former military sites into public land. In practice, this meant that the land surrounding these dumps was cleared of debris, but the munitions themselves remained, buried beneath layers of soil and forgotten under new structures. This strategy was implemented in several other countries across Europe, but it was by no means a universal solution. Even in the 1960s and 1970s, the problem persisted. As new developments took place across Europe, workers frequently uncovered bombs, artillery shells, and landmines, some of which were still active. In fact, the frequency of accidental detonations continued to rise well into the second half of the 20th century. By the time efforts to clear these sites became more widespread, large portions of Europe had already been developed over such dumps, making further efforts difficult or even impossible in some cases. The fate of ammunition dumps across post-war Europe remained a slow-moving, unresolved crisis throughout much of the 1950s and into the following decades. While the sheer scale of the problem had become more apparent by the late 1940s, economic pressures, logistical challenges, and a lack of coordinated international effort meant that many sites were left abandoned or buried under the growing infrastructure of peacetime Europe. Even as the continent slowly rebuilt, the reality of millions of tons of leftover ordnance still embedded in the soil, or buried under new construction, became a hidden but persistent legacy of the Second World War. By the mid-1950s, the situation was becoming ever more complicated. The immediate post-war rush to dismantle or safely destroy ammunition had waned, but it was clear that the risks posed by these vast dumps would not simply disappear with time. In Germany, particularly in the British, French, and American occupation zones, the early solutions of sealing off dumps or detonating dangerous munitions had been temporary at best. The presence of so much unexploded ordnance (UXO) in civilian areas remained a constant threat to populations. It was a dangerous gamble to leave them in place, given the human cost of accidental detonations that could occur with little or no warning. To understand the scale of the challenge, consider the fact that more than 200,000 tons of unexploded bombs and shells were believed to be still scattered across Germany alone by the end of the 1950s. The largest proportion of these munitions lay in former military bases, airfields, and other strategic locations. Yet, over time, the efforts to clean up these sites became more decentralized, and the scale of the problem began to overwhelm national governments. Even the growing influence of the European Economic Community, EEC, which sought to foster closer cooperation among European nations, did little to expedite the process of clearing ammunition dumps. Coordination among nations was hindered by bureaucratic inertia, national priorities, and limited funding, all of which meant that the legacy of wartime ordnance remained largely unaddressed. One notable example occurred in 1958, when a large-scale cleanup operation began in what had been the British occupation zone in northern Germany. However, the project quickly proved to be far more expensive and time-consuming than originally anticipated. Local authorities struggled to find the necessary equipment and personnel to carry out the task of clearing thousands of hectares of land from ordnance. In many cases, these operations were only able to focus on high-priority sites near urban centers or transportation hubs, leaving more remote dumps largely ignored. By the 1960s, it became apparent that no comprehensive solution to the problem existed. Instead, piecemeal attempts continued to clear the most dangerous sites, often with mixed results. Compounding the problem was the emergence of Cold War tensions. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Europe's geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The division between East and West now defined much of the continent, with the Soviet Union and its satellite states controlling Eastern Europe, while the United States and its allies controlled the West. The presence of ammunition dumps became a key strategic consideration in these new power dynamics. For example, in the Soviet occupation zone, later to become the German Democratic Republic, much of the ordnance was simply left in place, particularly in remote areas. However, in some cases, Soviet military authorities made use of these munitions for the early stages of the Cold War, adding a new layer of complexity to the post-war legacy of ammunition dumps. As part of their broader military preparations, both the Western and Eastern blocs continued to store vast amounts of military munitions, making it less pressing to deal with the remnants of the previous conflict. Ammunition and ordnance from the Second World War were seen by many military planners on both sides as reusable assets. As tensions escalated, particularly after the Berlin blockade and the Korean War, the desire to keep a large stockpile of weapons grew, even as the danger from old, leftover munitions continued to pose risks to civilian life. The 1960s brought a new wave of accidental detonations that underscored the dangers posed by lingering ammunition dumps. It was during this period that one of the most infamous incidents occurred in the town of Witten, West Germany, in 1963. A civilian construction crew, unaware of the hidden munitions underneath a former military base, accidentally uncovered a stash of unexploded ordnance. The explosion killed several workers and injured many more, sparking widespread public concern about the risks posed by the old munitions. This tragedy led to calls for more coordinated efforts to clean up these stockpiles. In response, some governments began to earmark funds for demining operations, but these efforts were still sporadic and localized. The growing threat of accidental detonations, however, was only part of the problem. The broader issue of repurposing or safely disposing of these munitions became a matter of increasing importance as post-war Europe modernized. As the 1960s wore on, various national governments, particularly in the Western Bloc, began to re-examine the potential value of old ordnance. Some ammunition dumps were slowly repurposed for non-military uses, such as turning former military installations into storage facilities or converting land for agricultural use. But for most of Europe, the presence of unexploded ordnance was a lingering presence that refused to disappear. In the 1970s, Europe saw an increase in the number of accidental discoveries of unexploded bombs, shells, and mines. In many cases, these munitions were unearthed during large infrastructure projects, such as the construction of highways, airports, and housing developments. For example, in the United Kingdom, a massive construction project near the town of Hounslow, west of London, unearthed several unexploded German bombs from the war. These types of discoveries became more frequent as Europe's post-war reconstruction reached deeper into formerly military areas. The shift in Europe's priorities during this time only compounded the issue. As the economic focus moved toward rebuilding and expanding industrial and residential infrastructure, the dangers of forgotten ammunition dumps were increasingly overlooked. The cleanup of unexploded ordnance was pushed further down the list of priorities, despite the fact that the risk to civilian populations remained high. The problem was particularly pronounced in areas that had once been strategic military sites or used as major wartime transportation hubs. By the time the European Union was formed in the 1990s, the legacy of abandoned ammunition dumps was still widespread. The financial cost of clearing these dumps continued to increase, and by the 1980s, it had become clear that most of the old ordnance would remain buried for decades to come. Some countries, such as Germany and France, began to develop more sophisticated and coordinated approaches to UXO clearance, but the task remained colossal. Germany, for instance, established the German Unexploded Ordnance Disposal Agency, Sprengstoffverteidigungsdienst, in the early 1980s, which led to a more organized and systematic approach to dealing with leftover munitions. However, despite this progress, many rural areas remained unsafe, as the clearing process was painstakingly slow. The long-term impact of these abandoned ammunition dumps continues to be felt today. Even as Europe's cities and infrastructure flourished, the legacy of war remained deeply embedded in the landscape. It is only in recent decades that many of these sites have been fully addressed, and even now, accidents continue to occur. Every year, several incidents of unexploded ordnance are reported, often discovered during construction or land redevelopment projects. The fate of the ammunition dumps left behind after World War II was one of prolonged neglect and sporadic action. In many cases, they became invisible to the general public as Europe recovered and modernized. But their presence served as a reminder of the war's far-reaching legacy, an enduring and unresolved consequence of a continent torn apart by conflict. The full cost of dealing with these ordnance stockpiles would never truly be calculated, but it would echo through the decades, reminding Europe that the war, though officially over, had not entirely finished its work.